Hello and welcome to Starbound's second channel. My name is Gabriel the Bibi Capaldi and I'll be your narrator today. But before we get into today's story, please do check down below that you are subscribed to the channel. It's 100% free and helps us pop up on your feed a bit more often. Emperor Mintar couldn't believe his eyes as he read the final report from a towering stack detailing accidents across every level of his government. Not a human army, not a crew of human pirates. You're telling me that all these incidents I've just read about were caused by a single human individual? The Emperor's skeletal frame hunched over the dark desk, his pale flesh conveying an unhealthy texture to those unfamiliar with his species. The only illumination came from a single orb hovering above the desk's surface, its weak light revealing the exposed bone protrusions jutting from his forehead like a crown of death. His long, pointed ears remained stiff as his two yellow eyes, the only vibrant features on his otherwise corpse-like face, fixed upon the figure standing before him. Like all Yril, Mintar's appearance struck terror into most galactic citizens, his skin bearing the grey-green pallor and texture that other species perceived as resembling decomposition, giving the impression of a walking cadaver that had somehow achieved consciousness and power. Across from him stood Zori, barely visible in the shadows beyond the orb's reach, shifting nervously from foot to foot.
"Yes, your Imperial Majesty," Zori replied. "One human did this. The assassinations of Duke Keva, Duchess Molani, Trade Minister Gixpol, Admiral Koek, and General Voss, all found dead in their sleep. No signs of forced entry, no witnesses."
Mintar's yellow eyes narrowed as he studied Zori more carefully. The intelligence officer was a Zenthari, a loyal one raised in the Yril homeworld, his forearms clasped tightly behind his back. Unlike the Yril, whose skin appeared deathly to other species, the Zenthari were considered among the more aesthetically pleasing species in the galaxy. But right now, Zori looked anything but composed. The Emperor's thoughts churned like acid in his mind. A single human? That had to be a mistake. He remembered visiting General Voss's fortress estate just months ago, layer upon layer of security, motion sensors, automated defense turrets, a personal guard detail of 30 elite warriors. Mintar himself would have found it challenging to penetrate those defenses even with a team of his most skilled assassins. The idea that one individual, especially a human, could accomplish what entire military units would struggle with seemed like either fantasy or deception. His suspicion grew. Someone was lying. Either Zori was feeding him false information, or there was a conspiracy so vast that they were using a single human as a scapegoat. Perhaps rival factions within his own empire were eliminating threats and pinning the blame on an external boogeyman. The Emperor's chair scraped against the stone floor as he rose to his full, imposing height of nearly 6 feet. He moved around the desk with quick steps, a blur under the faint light. When he reached Zori, he leaned down until his yellow eyes were level with the Zenthari's smaller frame, close enough that Zori could smell the musty scent that other species found unsettling about Yril physiology. "You have exactly 1 minute. Mintar's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a roar. "To convince me that all of this carnage was indeed caused by a single human, and not some elaborate conspiracy you're either part of or too competent to uncover. Choose your words carefully, Zori. My patience for deception died with my last intelligence director." Zori's 4 hands began gesturing frantically as words tumbled from his mouth.
"Your Majesty, it all began during the conquest phase of Colony 11. The Council wanted the first planet orbiting the red star, Kethmore, in the Outer Rim territories. The first exploration showed perfect conditions for terraforming. No intelligent life detected. Mineral wealth beyond—"
"Faster, and forget the irrelevant details." Mintar said, his breath hot against Zori's face.
Yes, Majesty. The terraforming crews arrived. Standard protocol initiated. Atmospheric processes deployed. Soil conditioning began. The massive soil-moving robots started landscape preparation. Everything proceeded normally for the first 3 weeks until...
I said faster, not stupider explanations. Zori's voice cracked under pressure.
One of the Class 7 soil movers stopped responding to commands. When terraforming crew Delta 7 went to investigate, they received a transmission over their emergency frequencies. A voice, a human voice, claiming the planet had an owner, that we were trespassing, and there would be consequences if we didn't leave immediately.
Mintar's expression remained skeptical, but something in Zori's description was beginning to feel authentic. Continue.
The crew supervisor ran a galactic database search for planetary ownership records. The results showed the planet was indeed privately owned, purchased through the Galactic Confederation's Territorial Commerce Division 18 months prior. The owner was listed as one human individual, Bartilli Vance.
How was I not informed of this? Mintar's voice carried the promise of violent retribution. Zori flinched.
Your Majesty, you've made it clear that you hate being bothered by minor administrative matters. The Terraforming Division, the Colonial Expansion Bureau, no one wanted to disturb you with what seemed like a simple property dispute. They decided to proceed with terraforming regardless, planning to pay the invasion fee and dispute ownership with the human.
Despite himself, Mintar felt a cold knot of worry forming in his stomach. This had the ring of truth. He had indeed made it clear that minor colonial hiccups should be handled without his involvement, but a single human causing this level of devastation still seemed impossible. What happened next?
The terraforming continued despite recurring equipment failures. Inexplicable malfunctions, communication blackouts, a supply shipment destroyed. The crews attributed it to normal operational challenges, but then...
Zori's voice grew smaller.
Then one of the Class 7 soil movers ran over a group of local creatures. The machine operator saw them well in advance, but didn't bother to stop or change course. When questioned later, he said he had ordered to maintain schedule and that a few animals weren't worth delaying operations. The crew supervisor backed him up, saying they couldn't slow down for every piece of local wildlife that wandered into their path.
Zori hesitated, his blue scales pale with fear. "What?" Mintar demanded.
"That's when our people started dying. The reports are vague, but I suspect the first to die was the machine operator who killed the creatures. Then the crew supervisors, then the terraforming director. Even after we halted the terraforming operation and began evacuation procedures, the deaths continued. And then..."
Zori's voice broke completely.
"Then it spread to the home world. Our nobles, our generals, dying in their sleep in the most secure locations in the Empire."
For the first time, Mintar felt the cold touch of genuine fear. The timeline made a horrible kind of sense. The methodical escalation, the precision strikes, the impossible penetration of their best security. This wasn't the work of an organization or conspiracy. This was something far worse. It was personal. The Emperor was about to speak when a thunderous explosion shook the chamber, sending the desk orb flickering and casting wild shadows across the walls. Before the echo faded, the massive doors burst open, and his personal guard rushed in, weapons drawn. "Your Majesty," the guard captain shouted, "we need to get you to the secure bunkers, immediately. There's been an attack on the palace's eastern wing." Mintar stood frozen, staring at the chaos erupting around him. Another explosion, closer this time, rattled dust from the ceiling. His mind reeled with the implications of what he'd just learned. What sort of crazy individual would do all this over some random creatures? He whispered to himself as his guards surrounded him, already knowing the answer would terrify him more than any army ever could. 3 months earlier, Bartilli Vance sat on a flat boulder watching the red sunset paint his world in shades of crimson and gold. The former assassin, known throughout the galaxy underworld as the Ghost, had paid an absurd fortune for this planet, more credits than some small governments possessed in their treasuries. But after a lifetime of working as a private problem solver, which was merely polite terminology for his real profession as one of the galaxy's most efficient killers, he'd accumulated wealth beyond measure. The irony wasn't lost on him that blood money had purchased his sanctuary. His days had settled into a rhythm that would have seemed impossibly mundane to anyone who'd known his reputation. Each morning he'd wake before the red star crested the horizon and begin his hikes across the rolling hills that stretched endlessly in every direction. The planet's gravity was slightly heavier than Earth's, making the walks excellent exercise, and the scenery never failed to ease the tension that had lived in his shoulders for decades. The landscape was alien, yet somehow familiar. Purple grass that swayed like wheat in the constant breeze, rock formations that refracted the red sunlight into spectacular light shows, and forests of what looked like massive coral structures that grew from the ground instead of the sea. Every day brought new discoveries, hidden valleys, underground caverns filled with luminescent minerals, streams of water so pure it tasted like nothing he'd ever experienced. In afternoons he'd hunt, not for sport, for necessity. His supplies were virtually limitless, but for the meditative focus it required. Tracking the local wildlife, a species of 6-legged creatures that moved like giant insects, demanded complete presence of mind. His dwelling had started as a prefabricated shelter, the kind used by survey teams and prospectors. But over the months, he'd expanded it using local materials and his own considerable skills. What had begun as a simple dome now looked like a comfortable wooden house. The evening ritual of maintenance had become sacred to him, checking the water recyclers, maintaining his equipment, preparing meals from a combination of his preserved supplies and edible local plants he'd carefully tested. Each task was performed with the same meticulous attention he'd once reserved for planning assassinations. But here, the precision served life instead of death. He'd chosen this solitude not because of guilt or nightmares about his victims. He'd grown numb to that part of his past long ago. No, the isolation was about managing the deeper wounds, the ones that predated his criminal career. The PTSD that had driven him into the underworld in the first place still lived in his nervous system like a hibernating beast, and the profound quiet of his planet was the only thing that consistently kept it sleeping. The trauma had its origins in his time as a cadet, fresh out of military academy and full of idealistic fervor about protecting humanity. He'd been 22 years old when the Keth Mori invasion fleet had arrived at Earth. The battle had lasted 6 days, and by the end, 3/4 of his graduating class was dead. Most of Earth's major cities lay in ruins, and young Cadet Vance had seen enough horror to last several lifetimes. But it wasn't the battle itself that had broken something inside him. Soldiers expected to face death. It was what came after, the execution of prisoners, the deliberate targeting of civilian shelters, the way the Keth Mori had laughed while burning hospitals. Humanity had won that war at some point, but Vance had learned that the galaxy was full of species that viewed human life as less valuable than the dirt beneath their feet. Now, in the silence of his own world, that beast of trauma finally had space to heal. The first time he'd encountered the local sentient species, he'd been returning from a hunting expedition when he'd spotted movement near his dwelling. His soldier's instincts had kicked in immediately. Weapons check, cover assessment, escape route planning. But when he'd crept close enough to observe, he found 3 creatures that looked like a cross between anteaters and lemurs, roughly the size of large dogs, investigating his supply containers with unmistakable curiosity rather than aggression. They had elongated snouts, perfect for digging into the ground, large expressive eyes that showed clear intelligence, and soft grey fur. When they noticed him watching, instead of fleeing, they'd sat back on their haunches and made a distinctive sound, a strange tibby-tibby-tibby that sounded almost like laughter. He'd started calling them tibbies. Over the weeks that followed, the tibbies had become regular visitors to his camp. They seemed fascinated by his technology and his daily routines, often sitting in a small group, watching him work on his dwelling or maintain his equipment. Their intelligence became apparent quickly. They learned to associate certain sounds with his activities. They brought him interesting objects they'd found, pretty stones, unusual plants, bits of metal from crashed meteors, and they clearly communicated with each other through a complex system of clicks, whistles, and that distinctive tibby sound. The breakthrough had come when he'd offered them food, not his military rations, which they'd rejected with obvious disgust, but some of the local fruits he'd tested for toxicity. Their delight had been unmistakable, and within days they'd begun bringing their young. The Tibby youngsters were impossibly cute, tiny versions of their parents with oversized eyes and fluffy fur that begged to be touched. They were also fearless, climbing on his equipment, investigating his dwelling, and even attempting to help with his daily tasks in ways that were more hindrance than assistance, but endlessly entertaining. Watching the family groups interact, seeing the care the adults showed for their young, the playful way they engaged with each other and with him, had awakened something in Vance that he'd thought was dead forever. He'd never allowed himself to consider having a family. His profession had made that impossible, and the trauma that drove him to that profession had convinced him he didn't deserve such happiness anyway. But he could appreciate the company of these creatures, could take pleasure in their trust and affection without the complicated emotional weight of human relationships. They asked nothing of him, except occasional food and the entertainment of watching him go about his daily life. In return, they provided companionship without judgment, curiosity without threat, and a kind of innocent joy that he'd forgotten existed in the universe. On quiet evenings like this one, watching the red sunset while a small group of tibbies nested near his fire, Vance had begun to think that dying alone on this planet, the only human in an entire world, wouldn't be the tragedy he'd once imagined. There was peace here, maybe even a decade or two of it, if he was careful with his aging body and the planet didn't spring any deadly surprises. It wasn't the life he'd imagined as a young cadet, but it was infinitely better than the existence he'd carved out in the shadows of the galaxy's criminal underworld. That peace shattered on a morning that had started like any other. Vance had been returning from his dawn hike when he'd heard the sound, a low rumbling that seemed to come from everywhere at once. At first, he'd attributed it to seismic activity. The planet occasionally experienced minor earthquakes due to its unique geological composition. But as the sound grew louder and more persistent, he'd realized it was coming from above. He'd scrambled to the highest point near his dwelling, a rocky outcropping that provided a clear view of the surrounding terrain, and watched in growing horror as the sky filled with ships. Not exploration vessels or research craft, but the massive, utilitarian bulk haulers and terraforming equipment that meant only one thing. Someone intended to reshape his world according to their specifications. The lead ship was enormous, a Class 7 atmospheric processor that could alter the chemical composition of an entire planet's air supply within months. Behind it came the soil conditioning platforms, the landscape modification rigs, and the transport vessels carrying what were undoubtedly thousands of workers and their supporting equipment. His first emotion had been simple disbelief. He'd purchased this planet through proper legal channels, filed all the appropriate paperwork, paid the fees, and received official confirmation of ownership. The Galactic Confederation's bureaucracy was many things. Slow, expensive, frustrating, but it wasn't typically fraudulent. His ownership should have been a matter of public record. But as he watched the first of the massive machines begin their descent toward his world's surface, disbelief had given way to a colder, more familiar feeling, the tactical assessment mindset of a professional killer evaluating a threat. The machines were vulnerable during landing. Their shields had to be lowered to deploy equipment, Their attention was focused on navigation rather than security, and they were following predictable patterns. A single person with the right skills and equipment could cause significant damage before anyone realized what was happening. But Vance had come to this planet to escape that part of his life. He'd left the ghost behind in the darkness between stars, and he'd been determined to keep it that way. Instead, he'd tried to be gentle. The sabotage of the first soil conditioning platform had been elegant and simple. Vance had waited until the machine was fully deployed and operating. The crew was inside their mobile command center, monitoring readings and adjusting parameters, completely unaware that someone was approaching their equipment. His infiltration skills, honed by decades of slipping past security systems that most people couldn't even detect, made reaching the machine's control systems trivially easy. A few carefully placed charges, small enough to disable rather than destroy, positioned to look like mechanical failures rather than sabotage, and the Class 7 soil mover ground to a halt. When the repair crew had emerged to investigate, Vance had been ready with his radio transmission. "This planet has an owner," he said, his voice calm and conversational. "You're trespassing on private property. There will be consequences if you don't leave immediately." He'd expected negotiations, legal discussions, maybe some bureaucratic back and forth while they verified his ownership claims and figured out how to compensate him for the inconvenience. What he'd gotten instead was laughter. "One lonely human," the crew supervisor had broadcast back, not bothering to encrypt the signal. "What's one soft skin going to do against a full terraforming operation? Keep your head down, and maybe we'll find you a nice reservation when we're done reshaping your little sandbox." The casual remark, the dismissive contempt, the assumption of his legal ownership meant nothing because he was alone. It had awakened something in Vance that he'd hoped was buried forever. Not the ghost, not yet, but something older and colder. The soldier who'd watched his friends die while aliens laughed at human suffering. His guerrilla campaign had begun the next day. Vance told himself he was showing restraint. The old him, the ghost, would have started killing immediately, efficiently removing threats until the survivors understood the cost of ignoring his warnings. But he wasn't that person anymore. He was just a man trying to protect his home and the innocent creatures who shared it with him. So instead of murder, he'd chosen sabotage. Equipment failures cascaded through the terraforming operation like a virus. Communication arrays developed mysterious faults that took days to repair. Supply shipments were delayed when their guidance systems malfunctioned and sent them to the wrong star systems. Atmospheric processors shut down randomly. Their computer systems crashed by code intrusions that looked like software bugs rather than deliberate attacks. Each incident was minor on its own, but the cumulative effect was devastating to the operation's timeline and budget. More importantly, it demonstrated that someone on the planet possessed sophisticated technical skills and detailed knowledge of their equipment. The terraforming crews had begun to look over their shoulders, jumping at shadows and suspicious of every unexpected sound. They'd increased security, posted guards, and installed additional sensors. But Vance had been evading security systems since before most of them were born. Their efforts were like using a fishing net to catch smoke. He'd been proud of his restraint, confident that eventually they would recognize the futility of continuing and withdraw from his planet. The legal ownership issue would sort itself out through proper channels, and he could return to his peaceful existence. That confidence had died when he'd found the Tibbies. Vance had been returning from another successful sabotage mission, this time disabling a mining probe that had been strip mining one of his favorite alleys, when he'd noticed the unusual silence. The Tibbies were normally active during the day, their musical calls echoing across the landscape as they foraged and played. But as he'd approached his dwelling, the only sound had been the wind through the coral forests. He found them in what had once been a meadow where they'd often gathered to feed on a particular type of root that grew in the purple grass. Now the meadow was a churned wasteland of torn earth and exposed rock. transformed by the passage of one of the massive soil conditioning vehicles. 7 tibbies lay scattered across the ruined ground, their grey fur matted with mud and blood, their bodies crushed beyond recognition. Among them were 3 of the youngsters, the fearless little ones who'd climbed on his equipment and brought him pretty stones as gifts. Nearby, partially buried in the churned earth, he'd found more bodies, an entire extended family group, at least 15 individuals, caught in the path of machines operated by beings who probably hadn't even cared they were killing sentient creatures. The radio chatter he'd intercepted from the machine operators had confirmed his worst fears.
"Heads up, everyone. Looks like the local wildlife doesn't have much survival instinct. Keep an eye on your proximity sensors, but don't slow down operations for every animal that gets in the way. Command wants this valley cleared by end of shift."
They'd seen the tibbies die and hadn't even bothered to stop. Something had broken inside Vance as he knelt beside the bodies of creatures who'd trusted him, who'd considered him part of their extended family group. The peace he'd found on this world, the healing he'd begun to experience, the hope that he might spend his remaining years as something other than an instrument of death. All of it was buried with the tibbies in the churned mud of their former home. When he'd stood up from that ruined meadow, it wasn't Bartilli Vance who'd walked away. It was the ghost, and the ghost didn't believe in words unless they were written in blood. The sniper shot that killed the soil mover's operator had been taken from nearly a kilometer away, through a gap in the machine's armor plating that most marksmen wouldn't have been able to hit with a targeting computer. The operator, a Keth Mori like the ones who'd invaded Earth decades ago, had died instantly, never knowing what hit him. But Vance had made sure the rest of the crew knew exactly what had happened and why.
"That was for the tibbies,"
he'd broadcast on their emergency frequency.
"You killed my friends. Now I'm gonna kill yours. And when I'm done with everyone on this planet, I'm gonna find your homeworld and continue the conversation there with your leaders."
The terraforming operation had 3 days left before he'd eliminated every alien on his planet. After that, he had research to do and a journey to plan. The hunt was just beginning. And 3 months later, it had reached the very core of the Empire. Mintar's guards moved in perfect formation around him, their weapons drawn and scanning every corner as their boots echoed against the stone floor. The Emperor's yellow eyes darted nervously between the shadows, his earlier confidence completely shattered by the implications of what he'd learned.
"This doesn't make sense,"
Zori protested, his forearms gesticulating frantically as he struggled to keep pace with the armed escort.
"Captain, you have to listen to reason. This human has spent months conducting precise surgical strikes, silent assassinations with no witnesses, no traces. Why would he suddenly abandon that approach for a direct assault on the palace?"
The guard captain didn't slow his stride.
"Orders are orders, intelligence officer. Secure the Emperor first. Analyze the tactical situation later."
"But that's exactly my point."
Zori's voice cracked with desperation.
"Every single target has been eliminated in their sleep, in supposedly secured locations, without any sign of forced entry. This human is a ghost. He doesn't announce his presence with explosions. Something about this doesn't fit his pattern."
"Maybe he's finally lost his mind," one of the younger guards suggested.
"No, you don't understand."
Zori pressed on, his blue scales flushed with agitation.
"The psychological profile suggests methodical planning, not random violence. Something's just—"
Another explosion thundered through the palace, closer this time, causing dust to rain from the ceiling. The guards immediately tightened their formation around Mintar, their attention completely focused on potential threats emerging from the shadows ahead.
"Enough speculation," the captain barked. "Save the analysis for when the Emperor is behind 3 feet of reinforced steel."
Zori opened his mouth to continue his argument, but the guards had stopped listening entirely, their training overriding any deep analyses. The intelligence officer fell silent, though his expression remained troubled as they continued their march through the darkened corridors. The secure room's entrance appeared ahead of them, a massive vault door built into the palace's foundational structure, designed to withstand direct bombardment. The captain stepped forward and placed his palm on the biometric scanner, which bathed his hand in green light before the massive locks began their mechanical disengagement.
"Your Majesty," the captain said, turning to Mintar as the door slowly swung open to reveal the chamber beyond. "Do you want the intelligence officer to accompany you inside?"
Mintar stared at the threshold of his sanctuary, weighing his options. Zori had proven useful in understanding the threat they faced, and his analytical mind might be valuable if the situation deteriorated further. On the other hand, the fewer people who knew the location of his emergency protocols, the better.
"Yes," he decided finally. "Bring him."
The two figures stepped across the threshold into a room that represented the pinnacle of defensive engineering: reinforced walls, independent life support, communication arrays, and enough supplies to last for weeks if necessary. The moment they were inside, the guards sealed the vault door behind them with a resounding clang. Mintar found himself staring at Zori in the sterile lighting of their metallic tomb, the full weight of their situation finally settling on his shoulders.
"A single human,"
he said quietly, almost to himself.
"One individual has brought the strongest empire in the galaxy to its knees."
The admission felt like swallowing poison, but he could no longer deny the evidence. His generals were dead, his nobles were dead, and now he was cowering in a bunker while explosions rocked his own palace. The mighty Yril Empire, which had conquered worlds and subjugated dozens of species, had been reduced to hiding from one vengeful human. The realization triggered something primal and violent in Mintar's psyche. His yellow eyes blazed with fury as his voice rose to a roar.
"When this is over, when we finally capture this vermin, I'm going to make him understand what it means to challenge the Yril Empire. I'll have him flayed alive, piece by piece, keeping him conscious for every second of it. I'll feed his flesh to him while he watches, then heal him and start again. For months, Zori, months of exquisite agony that will make him beg for the mercy of death, while I deny him even that release." "Yes, Your Majesty,"
Zori nodded eagerly.
"He deserves nothing less for his crimes against the Empire." "I'll broadcast his screams across every inhabited world in the galaxy," Mintar continued. "Absolutely, Your Majesty. We just need to survive first, and understand why this human is attacking the palace with bombs now."
Mintar began pacing the small chamber, his gaze constantly returning to the sealed metallic doors as his fury transformed into a philosophical rage. "This entire situation demonstrates everything wrong with humanity as a species. Look at this madness, Zori. An entire terraforming operation disrupted, countless lives lost, a galactic government threatened, all because of some insignificant creatures on a backwater planet. What rational being would escalate to this level of violence over such trivial matters? Perhaps it's time to reconsider our entire approach to human integration in galactic society," Mintar mused, his voice taking on a cold, calculating tone. "A species this volatile, this unpredictable, this willing to resort to extreme violence, maybe they shouldn't be allowed to exist at all. The galaxy might be safer if we simply eliminated the human threat entirely. Don't you think? Isn't that right, Zori?" The expected murmur of agreement didn't come. Mintar paused in his pacing, irritation flashing across his features as he turned toward where Zori had been standing. The intelligence officer was on the floor, a pool of blue blood spreading beneath his still form, his four eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling. Mintar's mind reeled, unable to process what he was seeing. They were in a sealed room. The door was locked from the outside. There was no way anyone could have...
"Those are pretty bold words about eliminating humanity,"
a voice said from the wall itself, no louder than a whisper.
"Especially coming from someone who couldn't even kill a single human."
As Mintar watched in horror, a section of the wall began to shift and move. What he had taken for metallic paneling was actually some form of adaptive camouflage, and emerging from it was a figure in advanced stealth armor that had been perfectly mimicking the room's surfaces.
"The explosions were just a distraction,"
the human said conversationally, as if discussing the weather.
"Figured you'd have a secure room somewhere, and that your people would be predictable enough to bring you straight here. I've been waiting for quite some time."
Mintar stumbled backward toward the sealed door, his hands frantically searching for the emergency release mechanisms, but the controls didn't respond. The human had clearly disabled them during his wait.
"You can't. This is... How did you..."
Mintar's words came out in broken gasps as panic overrode his ability to form coherent sentences. The human stepped forward, a length of synthetic rope appearing in his hands with practiced efficiency.
"You know, Your Imperial Majesty, I heard every word of your little speech just now. The part about eliminating humanity was particularly interesting."
"Wait!" Mintar pressed himself against the sealed door, his voice cracking with desperation. "I didn't even know about those creatures. I had nothing to do with what happened on your planet. This is all a misunderstanding." The human paused, tilting his head slightly as if considering the Emperor's words. For a moment, Mintar felt a flicker of hope that reason might prevail.
"You know what's funny about that defense?"
the human said finally, the rope growing taut in his hands.
"When you have as much power as you do, inaction and oversight are equally grave sins as causing the wrong in the first place."
The rope settled around Mintar's throat, and as the Emperor's world began to fade to black, his last conscious thought was a bitter realization. He would die here. The human's final words followed him into darkness.
"I'll be taking my planet back now."